here we are in another super heavy moment in our country, in our community, in our houses, in our bodies. I was sharing with you as we were preparing to kind of go live is that the universe conspired, I think, to bring us together because I'm in a moment where fellowshipping with people that get it matter. And you have been directly in this work longer than I have been. And I just want to get a sense of what's on your heart right now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Chanda. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be with you. You are absolutely right that we need folks who share this common experience in this time. We need to listen and be able to share deeply and openly with one another. And that's really what's on my heart, quite frankly. I have been in the last 24 hours with wrestling with the realities of the pandemic and protests for freedom and justice in America. And, the announcement related to essentially no charges. Let's be clear, no charges for the officers who are responsible for Breonna Taylor's death. And so it remembers, it puts back together the reality of the diminished value of Black life in America, particularly for Black women. And I find myself, as I shared with someone yesterday, triggered by this moment where I see communities boarding up buildings and property to protect the property from the people whom they plan to disappoint. And I see communities pay millions of dollars to ask people to go away because they can't give them the reality of justice, of giving them the lives of their family members. And I experience the irony of the moment where we lift up the value of quote unquote frontline healthcare workers who have kept us safe in the context of a pandemic. And yet a Black one in her 20s who is sleeping in her bed does not warrant charges when she's killed for being startled. I hurt right now. I am triggered in this moment, and I need my people. I need community.
Yeah, I sat yesterday and I said, there were people that emailed and said, oh, there was an indictment. No, there was no indictment yesterday. There was a charge for the bullets that went through a wall of a white neighbor's home, as I understand it, but not for bullets that went through Breonna Taylor's body.
Yeah. And
no charges for the bullets that went through the upstairs neighbor who was Black. Yeah. And, I am just sitting here saying, are these lives given to us in this moment to make so clear the injustice? Like, how much more clear does it need to be before we really move on significant change?
Yeah, I wrestle with this, and we get to the structural realities, right? I don't know that it's not clear. I don't know that people don't understand. One of the shadow sides of my own approach to leadership, my wife tells me, is that I expect people to know better, and I shouldn't expect people to know better. But that's kind of where I come from. I don't believe that people need to be convinced. I don't believe that there needs to be further evidence. I'm finally at the point where I believe some people we just need to prevail over, because the reality is this is a power problem. The reality is folks have learned the lesson. I was in a conversation with Reverend Sharpton last week, and he said, what validated the protest movement in the 1960s was the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. So we remember those protests and that movement with high regard for advancing American society because of the validation of the public policy change. I think in as much as he has learned that lesson, policymakers have learned that lesson in Washington, D.C. And so people stand pat and refuse to move the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act through the U.S. Senate as an act to assure that this movement of protest is not validated. Not that it didn't produce the legislation, it has. It has passed the House of Representatives, but that passage through the Senate, the signing into law would validate this moment, so we wouldn't be having arguments about whether people are protesting without a perspective or a point, or prospecting without an end in mind. There's a very clearly articulated end in mind. That is the freedom of people from the terrorism that is exhibited through the criminal justice system for Black and brown people in this country. What we lack right now is the political power to move it through the systems of government to implement the kind of public policy change that is required. So this is not about people being convinced. This is about people being prevailed upon with more power and us getting more power to the people who actually want change.
Yeah. The other thing that I was sitting in yesterday, as I was convinced that there would be protests across the country, and I was convinced that it would grow into actions of despair, right? And knowing the conversations that I have been in around behaviors, around looting, around the lighting of fires, around disruptive behavior, in light of these decisions, I remember just really simply just stopping and praying and saying, please don't riot. Please let this moment be about the injustice that happened. And let's not allow for the media and others to pivot to the behavior in the communities that have been victimized, not agreeing with behavior. And then we see the officers that were shot. And you were in Ferguson, and we'll talk about that. And we know that Ferguson, there were so many peaceful protests. And we know that there were some disruptors. And I'm curious on how you were able to balance or even if you spent the energy talking to people that wanted to, right? Like, do you even expend the energy with that frame of mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult to talk about this objectively without objectifying. So I think the only way to recognize and to truly honor what's happening with people is to segment in a few ways. Number one, we have to honor that people have been traumatized persistently and triggered acutely in these moments. And so there are those, when you are in the street, on the ground, with people in the midst of that triggering and the experience of that trauma, then they need care. And so part of the energy you got to give, if you love people, if you love humanity, is you got to give care to that energy. And, you talk to others who have been who are on the ground in Ferguson, like Brother Sekou, and I'm sure he would attest. And part of what our responsibility was to provide care to people who were triggered and traumatized. And that's the energy that you give it, right? Because to speak about that expression that comes out in a manner that people don't understand in moments when they're grieving, when they're mourning, when they're hurting, is to objectify that humanity as if it is to be intellectually, cogently linear. There is nothing, permission to speak freely. There ain't nothing in our emotions that's linear. If you ever loved anybody, There ain't nothing linear about love. And so when people are in pain and they're hurting, there's nothing linear, there's nothing intellectual, there's nothing cognitively aligned about that. So the energy that you've got to give it is loving care. That's first and foremost. Second, I've got to say, we've got to honor, especially in this moment when there's so much evidence of it, that public protest and peaceable assembly continues to be jacked by people who want to advance a narrative that it is somehow violent when it's really a response to violence. What do I mean? On the night of the announcement of the No True Bill and the Darren Wilson case in Ferguson, there were people who came into the community with long guns, were sitting on the top of buildings, pointing them down at us in the street as we got tear gas. And those people were not police. Those people were carrying guns in order to implement violence upon us. And we have seen, as we saw in Minneapolis, that there were people who lit things on fire in the midst of protests who were not there for the protest.
So it's Jacob Blake, right? Jacob Blake, the shooting, like he walked past the police with his long gun.
Right? And earlier in the night, he had been in conversation with the police, talking about how he was there to protect property. So we've got to honor, first and foremost, people are traumatized and being triggered. We've got to honor, second, that there are people engaged, using the cover of the protest in order to engage in anarchy. And those are not always people who are there for the cause. Sometimes it's people who are there to demean the cause. And finally, we got to come back to the very real matter that we have malformed memory about protest and peaceable assembly in American life. We act like, right, we compare this moment to the Montgomery bus boycott as if people were happy with the Montgomery bus boycott. We compare this moment to King's march through Memphis as if that march was successful on King's first or second try. It wasn't. It was successful on Coretta Scott King's third try. We act as if the Boston Tea Party was something that was not subversive in American history. Nobody wants protest when it happens. And so we critique it and say things, we add addendums to it. We use words like peaceful to make it sound better. We don't want any kind of protest. Let's own it. And we don't think positively about any until we want to compare it to the moment by way of critiquing the moment. So let's be clear. Protest is to disturb the peace. It is to disturb the peace. It is to disturb the status quo, because the status quo is killing Black and brown people, young and poor people, queer and trans people. So I don't understand any protest that's peaceful because it is there to disturb the peace. And there is no protest that is welcome because the system desires stasis. And so peaceable assembly, which is what most of these things are, I just want to use the language of the Constitution, is a right of ours. The Declaration, the Constitution does not give police the option of declaring something that was peaceable, unpeaceful. Declaring it unlawful is the language that they use. And I've seen them too many times declare a gathering where people are grieving as an unlawful assembly so they could do whatever they wanted to do.
Like they did last night and right, with Breonna Taylor. I'm watching it on television where these people are peacefully protesting, if we want to use that language. They're walking down the street to express the injustice, right? Their reaction to an injustice. And I'm watching the police tackling people that were peacefully walking and like raging, right? Bringing more rage into a situation they're not caring for, right? And let me just be clear, like I have officers in my family. This is not anything, like all the officers were not doing that, but it's very, very clear that they did not help what happened yesterday.
And what's interesting about Louisville is that if we track the last 195 days of pain, of grief, of mourning, and we have seen what we saw in Ferguson, which is we know how to de-escalate. Actually, doling down police presence pulling the National Guard out has actually kept things more peaceful over time. What happened at the night of the announcement was they ratcheted up presence again when they had things relatively managed throughout the process. And when you escalate presence of police, you actually get, or you put out people who are more armed or more guarded, more shielded, then you actually raise the anxieties of the community and the people. And this is where you begin to get conflict. So why, after managing relatively well a very tense situation for almost 200 days, folks decided to provoke hurting people on the night of the announcement? I just don't understand. But again, I'm just very clear that we don't do better when we know better. We do better when we're compelled to do better. And I really appreciate you making the point, Chanda, about officers, right? We all know individual officers who do well, who are faithful, valuable members of our communities and our congregations. This is not about officers. This is about a system of policing. This is about a system of criminal justice that makes its bones on the backs of Black and brown people, right? One of the things we talked about in Ferguson, we got to know was that we got to disparate contact with Black and brown communities because cities were balancing their budgets on the backs of tickets and fines. So they needed to have contact with people in order to get the revenue to pay the expenses of the city. Now, I don't know one police officer, still haven't met one, maybe you have, Chanda. I don't know one police officer who ever signed up, went through the academy, went through the training in order to write tickets. I don't know nobody who did that, right? No, they don't want to be armed collection agents for a system that is perverted. Nobody signs up for that, right? And so in this way, we have also made them subjects to systems of subjugation. We have made them subjects of a system of oppression and ripped elements of their identity away from them by putting them on an assignment that they never signed up for. So, no, this is not...
by not addressing the situation, we are actually making it more dangerous for them to police.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm not about anyone's humanity being diminished, right? I am about honoring those, and I feel compelled to even say this as a man of faith and as ordained clergy. I say that the responsibility in all situations of oppression of the community of the church is to be on the side of the people with the least power, right? In an imbalance, a situation of oppression or violence, it is the responsibility of people of faith, especially Christian people, to be on the side of the people with the least power. And so when I speak with that in mind, I speak with that ethic, right? And so the communities who get prevailed upon, the people who get killed and don't get remembered, who get disappeared when an attorney general speaks, whose life is devalued, those are the people that people of faith have a responsibility to speak up for. So I appreciate that people have, as I have had, quite frankly, growing up in the life of the church, a police officer was one of my most significant mentors, helped to shape me, helped to mold me, helped to keep me to be a person of faith in the life of the church. And I understand I got friends and pastor friends who have good deacons who are officers in their churches and good disciples in the life of the congregation. But I don't understand good Christian people, good people of faith who can't stand up and call the kinds of violence that we have seen, call the kind of racism that we have seen within these police departments out. And I don't know if the blue code is more important to you, or the blue shield is more important to you, or the thin blue line is more important to you than your life of discipleship. I think you need to wrestle with that.
Yeah.
You and God need to have a conversation about that, because the racists that we found out about when we did studies on the St. Louis Police Department and their emails, we know that 10 to 15% of the department is walking around with those kind of racist views. It took public investigation and media support to find that out about the police departments for us outside the department. It doesn't take that for the Black and brown officers to know that. They know who the racists are. And so I don't understand how you're a faithful disciple in somebody's church and you're covering that up. And so I don't understand why a pastor would defend that officer.
Yeah. So you just raised something else, and then you brought out Reverend Sharpton's, you brought up Reverend Sharpton, and he was here in Minneapolis following George Floyd. And at the George Floyd memorial that was aired, he talked about the knee on the neck of Black Americans in everyday world. Like the knee has been on our necks, right? Like the analogy of that, right? And what it just struck me that, and essentially what he was saying is that you have brown and Black people in your organizations, in your churches, in your business, in your foundations, and your nonprofits, and your whatever, right? Like there are people that are saying, in essence, get your knee off my neck, listen to the injustice, understand what my experience is. And that is also true for Black officers and officers that understand what is happening to brown and Black communities. And they do know what's happening, and they are also not being listened to. And they're also being attacked by community in terms of like, why are you aligning with the people that are harming us? And so they're in a very tough position. And I'm wondering if you have any insight, because they're operating in a system and they also need to protect their lives.
Yeah, I encourage, a couple of things. In St. Louis, some people will decry this and some people will applaud this. We have two police unions. We've got the official police union and we have a Black police union, the Ethical Society of Police. And so the same things that have helped us to build power within systems broadly will work for police who are trying to do this as well. So I think with the kinds of issues that we have, I don't see how a major city, at least, doesn't have a Black police union that is contending for power within those systems as well in an organized approach and way. Because it knows, quite frankly, that even the union itself is complicit. So I think there has to be some organization among African-American officers who believe that this is a challenge in the same way that, quite frankly, these kinds of subset caucus groups and otherwise live within major corporations, within large corporations in our community, right? So if there could be a Black caucus at Target of their employees to make sure they're nurtured and supported and can contest and contend for resources and support for them, there should be a Black police union in every major city throughout the United States of America, right? That's number one. Number two, I think there should be space, and they have to wrestle with what it means, to your point earlier, that their white colleagues, let me just, no, not all their white colleagues, their white racist colleagues that are terrorizing Black communities are making them more unsafe. And so I think they've got to place a calculus of greater value on the fact that they are being made unsafe by their white terrorizing colleagues than they are being made by depending on those same people to have their back, right? This is the irony. You're protecting those people because they got to have your back when you're on the street, when those are the people who are creating the separation between you and the community who sent you forth. Right? Let's wrestle with this, right? I make this distinction all the time, and it's not just about police, it's also about politicians, it's also about pastors and preachers, right? I make the distinction between African-American elected officials and Black politicians, right? African-American is a census category. Black is a consciousness and a commitment to a body of people who shape you and sent you forth. So if you're going to be a Black police officer, you have to understand a responsibility to the Black community that shaped you and sent you, gave you all the credentials to be accepted in the academy, gave you the nurturing and the support when you come home dejected by a situation on the force and in the office. It's your Black family, it's your Black community, it's your Black church that gives you the oomph, that gives you the push, that gives you the energy to go back up that mountain again. And so when it comes to choosing between the system that's harming you two and the community that is actually shaping you to be able to be resilient in a system, choose your people every time.
Yeah, yeah. I really super appreciate that. And so then you also made a distinction with white officers, right? You backed it up and said not all white officers. Let me be clear, it's the white racist officers. So, in this argument that could be so polarizing and that could be so black and white, what I think is important about that statement is number one, what is it? Everyone that looks like you, right? Like, I mean, some of your people aren't your people. And there's other people that may not appear to be your people that are your people. And so can you talk about that on the white side?
Yeah, I really appreciate, I've been wrestling this summer with my son because he read with a group this summer, Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I love that my 15-year-old decided to push back against one of his teaching assistants who said that Black people can't be racist. And he read deeply the text. And he said, no, what we need to be thoughtful about is whether someone is racist or anti-racist. And this has to do with whether they're advancing racist ideals and policies, right? And so I think that's a helpful frame. I think it's a remarkable gift that Dr. Kendi has given us to think about who's being harmful in these situations. Because if you're just looking for black and white, then you're confused when you hear the Attorney General in Kentucky speaking yesterday because he's a black man, member of a black fraternity. Right? He's got the marks. He's checking them off, right? So I think it's really important for us to be mindful of this anti-racist frame, that it's really about who's advancing racist ideas, who's advancing racist policies, who's creating a context that allows that to shape how we interact with one another. And so in that, I got to, look, you made me too comfortable, Chanda. I'm trying to be real nice and respectful, right?
I want you to be real.
Not as much flame for black preachers who stand up behind the police chief after some black people got killed as I have for white police officers, right? Because that's the same kind of, quite frankly, that's even worse. That's a blessing of the system of injustice and oppression that is robbing the life and humanity that is God-breathed out of God's children. So no, it's not about black or white. It's about racism and about anti-racism. And we have to root that out based upon people's active behavior as it relates to these systems and policies and ideas.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about our kids. So you brought up your son who's 15, and listeners might hear your 5-year-old daughter playing in the background. And what I actually love about the contracts of the conversation we're having is that I can hear your daughter being a 5-year-old, right? I can hear her playing in a way that is innocent, right? While you have a 15-year-old black son who is diving deep into injustice that are happening in our country, while he's viewing black men and young people getting killed that go viral, that wrestles with his humanity and how we see him and how we see people that look like him and come from our community. And I have 5 kids. I have 1 daughter. I have 4 sons. So while we're in this moment, we're also responsible for the next generation who is thankfully carrying a baton, but they have a weight that I did not have growing up, witnessing this. I may have heard about it, but I did not witness it. How do we, you're getting ready to go into, I think you may have started at the Children's Defense Fund, quite a legacy organization for you to lead into, but what about our children?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you. I appreciate you honoring the presence of my daughter in this 24-hour period when Breonna Taylor has been made invisible. And to speak of my son, my 15-year-old son, I have 3 boys and 1 girl. And my oldest son at the time that Michael Brown was killed was 9 years old. So this 15-year-old was 9. And I recall one afternoon in August, I picked them up from school, picked up all the boys, had them in the back seat, had to run and pick up some cleaning, some dry cleaning, trying to, be my good, respectable self. So I had to go pick up some suits from the dry cleaner. And I'm driving them back to the house, and we hear on the radio updates about the situation in Ferguson and what is happening with Michael Brown. And my 9-year-old, who's now 15, says from the backseat, "Dad, every time I hear about Michael Brown, my stomach starts to hurt," right? He's not ill physically. He's experiencing in his body the expression of the trauma, right? This boy gonna be all right, right? Number one indicator of the well-being of a child is the education, the level of education of the mother. My wife is a doctor. She's a dentist. He's growing up in a solidly middle-class family with familial supports in a magnet and advanced school. He is largely going to be all right. But when he hears about it, his stomach starts to hurt. So I say that to say that is a moment of experience of trauma for him at 9 years old that all of our children carry in this moment of American history. They carry it in their bodies. They will carry the impacts in their bodies. And we have to remember that we cannot shield them from it because they pick up as much. John Powell suggests that we are even foolhardy to speak of consciousness because our subconscious processes information so quickly that we can't even keep up, right? So I say that to say young people are experiencing this fully. They're taking it in. They know it. And so we've got to resource ourselves to be in dialogue with them about it. And we've got to keep them close to some hopeful resources. And in this unique moment, you speak of the work I'll be doing with the Children's Defense Fund, we also have to remember the uniqueness of 2020. We're going to remember 2020 for the protests. We're going to remember it for the pandemics. We're going to remember it for the presidential election. What we may forget is that 2020, according to U.S. Census estimates, is the first year in American history where the majority of children under the age of 18 are non-white. This is the first year, and the demographics aren't going back, when to speak of children, to speak of child well-being, is to speak of racial equity and racial justice, right? So I say that to say this is disproportionately important as Black and brown children become the rising majority in American life, right? These are the people who are coming forth. And so to tend to their trauma, to tend to this moment for them, and to create the conditions for them to fully live into their purpose is our essential call. I think I see over your shoulder, Chanda, Eddie Glaude's Begin Again. His work about James Baldwin's America and his lessons for our own. And one of the things I really appreciate about how he enters into that text where he starts talking about the ironies of America and the lie is he tells this story of Jimmy Baldwin in his first time meeting Stokely Carmichael, right? That he's invited in, Jimmy's invited in by the Nonviolent Action Group there. And after he gives his talk at the symposium, he goes to spend much of the night talking with these students in a small apartment because he had need of Johnny Walker Black. I know I shouldn't have said that. You got
Yes, I get it though. I understand that.
So they stayed up all night solving all the problems of the world in 1963 in the midst of a moment very much like this. And what he says before he leaves is he commits his writing to them. He says that everything he writes as a Black writer, he must write in order to protect them. And he finally closes out with these words of goodbye to them. He says, "I shall never betray you." And I think that's the commitment we've got to make to our children. As we talk about having policy conversations, as we talk about how we will push into spaces to create the conditions for them to thrive, we have to first imagine who is the young person that we most love, we feel most accountable to, and see ourselves making that pledge. I, Starsky Wilson, declare that I will never betray you. And that means we're going to lose some friends. right? We're not going to be able to walk the nice middle-class path and not betray our children, because that middle-class path will have us to betray them. That nice central mainstream path will not have us to push up against an election that will be contested and will be tense and could lead to some major conflict. People are going to tell us to be comfortable and to be civil in order to keep things okay. No. If you do that, you might be betraying your child, because they need an environment that is free and is open, that is actually democratic, doesn't just have the marks and the ideals, that lives out the truth of the story we tell ourselves about America, but won't live in the lie.
Yeah, and this conversation could appear that is only about the health and well-being of brown and Black children.
Right.
But it is about the health and well-being of all of our children.
Yeah, the days after Charlottesville, I gave a talk in an in-service to educators in a largely white suburb called Webster Groves in the St. Louis region. We partnered with them to plant a Children's Defense Fund Freedom School in one of our local churches, but for students in that district.
I'm envisioning your daughter. I'm sorry. I can hear her play, and she is like having at it back there. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt.
She's fully in it, right? She's figuring out virtual school. She knows how to work Teams better than me. Like all of that.
I love it. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt. So Charlottesville. Mm-hmm.
So days after Charlottesville, I'm giving a talk to all the educators in the Webster Groves Independent School District about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so someone asked a question valuably, rightfully. What about, we're talking about cultural competency, the need for cultural competency in education. What about our white students, they asked. I said, well, when I'm talking about the importance of cultural competence, and when I'm talking about the value of seeing Black and brown students in the curriculum and in the books that are chosen, I'm talking as much about the mental health, stability, and well-being of white children as I am about Black and brown children. Well, what do you mean? The shock of Charlottesville and the young men, including some from one of our local universities who were out there with tiki torches surrounding the church where my dear and best friend Tracy Blackman was inside preaching to terrorize people of faith in an ecumenical and interfaith gathering. Part of what those white men were expressing was the jarring, triggering trauma of finding out that they have not been in the global majority in any of the days of their life. They grew up believing that the world should center around them rather than that they lived in a multiracial emerging democracy. They believed, based on a Western-centric perspective, that white people rule in the majority and are the majority in the world, when the truth is people of color have been the global majority for a long time. People of color are the global majority, but they got books and they learned in systems that centered them and didn't balance out a perspective of other people. And so they were absolutely vulnerable when someone offered them a white supremacist perspective. They were vulnerable when someone talked to them about the hierarchy of human value. They were vulnerable when someone told them that men should be in leadership all the time. They were absolutely vulnerable. And when the lights got turned on of a multiracial coalition in America that could elect Black and brown people and that could put queer and trans people in the office, they began to react in negative and violent ways. And I say, if you want to care for young white boys and girls in a classroom, then you need to shape an environment that exposes them to the beauty of multi-ethnic, multiracial diversity for their psyche and well-being, if nothing else. Because part of what we're wrestling with is that people are being shocked into the fact that they've got to share the world with other people. And what's unfortunate is that we as adults have allowed them to believe that they didn't for so long. We got a responsibility to care for them.
Yeah, that's a word right there. I have two other things that I want to touch on. One is Black people in leadership. And the number of conversations that I'm sitting in, right? So we're talking about our children, we're talking about the system, we're talking about injustice. And then we have leaders that are in position that have a responsibility in their communities, in their organizations, in their institutions that are also grieving, that are also in a moment of sheer exhaustion, in some cases feeling hopeless, in some cases feeling invisible, in some cases feeling insufficient, and in most cases feeling all of those things, right? And so do you have a word for how we need to care for each other and for people that are on those teams, for people that are those peers, for people that are responsible for being in relationship to those people? What might be some ways in which they can honor the leadership and what's required?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate this question. I wish I could give attribution better to this statement, but it's just one of the brilliant think pieces that was put out there in the midst of this moment. And it's that, everyone should know, every leader should know, every corporate leader should know, every nonprofit leader should know that your Black people are not all right. So space needs to be given to breathe, to grieve, to catch up, and to process. All Black leaders need that in this moment. I say that to those who lead with Black leaders, and I say that to the Black leaders. We have been so remarkably resilient a people that our very existence is a sign of hope. And for me, a note that God is still working, because with all I know of history, there should be no Black people in America. There's just been too much trauma over time. And so, but taking that in, we often think we're going to be all right. And so I say to those leaders, breathe, take time. You are not all right. You need to be able to take care of yourself. And whether that means experiencing community now through Zoom calls with your line sisters and your line brothers and your and the folks you know from high school, bringing together reunions, if it means really long walks, if it means jogging or running. I thought I was running until I did it with somebody else, and I found out I'd been jogging the whole time. Increased physical activity. These are things that we have to do to be able to provide. Now, I also do think there is a responsibility that comes with leadership. And so, in as much as we who are called leaders in this moment and within these organizations need care, we also still have a duty to the communities that have sent us forth. And so I think we also have to put our relative pain in context of the great distress of scores of Black people in our communities, right? I went to a meeting one time. You and I both work in philanthropy, and I went to a meeting my first meeting of the Association of Black Foundation Executives years ago. And I was in this room, and people were talking about trauma, and people were talking about, how difficult it is to work in these systems, in these organizations. And I have the privilege that I've worked in philanthropy as a CEO. So these are people who have been program officers, program directors, vice presidents, and they were talking about how racist these systems were, how difficult it is to work in. And I'm sitting in the room like, y'all are the most educated, well-off group of Black people I've been in a long time with this many. Are we really sitting here complaining, right? I was so wrong. I was so wrong because I understood this responsibility piece without understanding the care piece. And I think we've got this piece where we take one and not the other. And so I think it's important for us to care for ourselves, and it's important to know that there are those who have it so much worse than us. And it is our absolute duty and obligation to be our fully Black, brilliant selves, our fully brown, brilliant selves, to figure out how to work the systems that we have been engaged and allowed space in order to do better for our Black and brown sisters and brothers who are literally on the street, who are literally being killed. And so that balance is critically important. It requires so much of us that we have to take care of ourselves. And that, finally, I'll say, requires us to keep a deep and consistent proximity to our people who have need. I encourage people, we've got to keep those relationships. I encourage people, if they're people of faith, that your voluntary spaces say a lot about you, right? And so if where you go every day is determined by capitalism, who got to be in here to get paid a certain amount of money, and you spend 40 hours a day, 40 hours a week, 60 hours a week, 80 hours a week in that space, then your other time should be spent in ways where you're in loving and diverse environments that expand and extend beyond the constraints of capitalism. You ought to be in a church, a synagogue, a mosque with some poor people that you have deep and lasting relationship with, so that you every now and then can see their face when you're making a decision about the allocation of resources in the context of a capital environment, no matter what that environment be. So I think that proximity to need is really important for us as well, especially as Black leaders.
Mm-hmm. The last piece that you led me right into is the role and the responsibility of philanthropy. And, I'm watching people here and across the country in the aftermath of George Floyd, right? It's been in the aftermath of Mike Brown, let's get Black men to work. There's always these reactions, right? And I remember watching this in Ferguson and saying, it wasn't because he was unemployed that he got shot.
Thank you.
So I don't understand the rationale, but needless to say, yes, there were resources needed, but the solution didn't match the problem.
Yes.
And so I'm watching some of that happening, and I either read it in the Ferguson Commission or something that you had written, that do you think that we are making movement towards a more just future, or are we doing things in the appearance of action and response?
Yeah, we've got this, instant popcorn culture where we think we got to have the answer overnight. One of the things we're pretty intentional to do with the Ferguson Commission process, having read about other commissions, having read about these riot commissions in the past, is we realize that they tend to be underfunded. They tend to not have enough time to do their work. People want to answer in 90 days for a problem that's taken 90 years. And they tend to be used by political forces in order to manage people's and process people's emotions and feelings. So we're very intentional that we're going to take our time. And we're going to take our time so that we can do the education over the period of time and educate community members over time in an issue that was going to take time. So all of those 30-day solutions, right? You can discount all of them, right? Because folks had not taken the time to really listen and think deeply about the issues, the challenges, and the problems, and they've not listened to the people who have the challenges in their everyday life. And so I do think we've got to spend time listening, and we've got to invest for the future. One of the things that we were not able to get done, but that we called for in the Ferguson Commission report, was a 20-year managed fund for racial equity infrastructure in the St. Louis region. We said we need to invest in having the resources to do this work for a generation. And we need to put that in an endowment or some managed fund, because if we deploy it all now, it'll be gone. Somebody's going to forget. There's going to be another problem, because you know the terminology of funder ADD. Every new cycle, new logic model, new theory of change, new leader, there's going to be a different way the foundation do their work, right? So we needed to invest in civic infrastructure to be able to pursue this work over a generation. And that is a critical thing. We didn't get that done, and we just this year launched it. We launched a collaborative fund for racial healing here now 6 years after the moment, because so many people wanted to respond with immediate checks, to your point, for workforce development, for infant mortality. Everybody chose their issue. They made it fit their thing without realizing that their thing didn't work. So I like to center this story about the journey of Ferguson. 3 things happened that year. Number one, 2014 was the 250th anniversary of the city of St. Louis. And so we made a decision about how we would honor that anniversary. Would we do major civic planning and visioning for the future, or would we mark it with high celebration? We said, let's not do that planning stuff. Let's just have a bunch of parties. And so we were going to have a big party. Our birthday in St. Louis is Valentine's Day. So on Valentine's Day, particularly because it's cold in St. Louis, we had a burning love party. It was a big bonfire outside in Forest Park, right? We had a big party, Then all over town, we had these birthday cakes. So at all the significant locations in town, you had a birthday cake, So near the Arch, there was a birthday cake. By City Hall, there was a birthday cake. Near the first Emo's Pizza, it's really important for St. Louis, Emo's Pizza, there was a birthday cake. And so all these places, that's what we were going to do. We were going to have this big celebration, and that was it. And then in June, we got something to celebrate, right? So Charity Navigator named St. Louis the most charitable St. Louis region in the country. We ain't hating on Minneapolis, but that's what happened in 2014. Right? So we thought we started patting ourselves on the back. We're so wonderful. We're so charitable. 2 months later, Michael Brown lay in the middle of the street. 4.5 hours. So here, we're patting ourselves on the back saying, we got no planning to do. We're so charitable. We invest in all these wonderful programs. And here, for 4.5 hours, we were arrested by the image of an 18-year-old, who all our charitable impulses could not save from being dead in the street and laying there, to the terror of his neighborhood and his mother trying to get past yellow police tape to get to her son for 4.5 hours. Charity did that. So to respond with charity would mean we would spend our time doing that again. We would do that again when Antonio Martin was killed by police just on Christmas Eve. Later that year, we would do that again when Von Derek Myers was killed in the city of St. Louis in that same year. We would do it again with Kajimi Powell, would be killed by police even though he had a behavioral health challenge. And he had essentially what my mama would call a case knife that you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with. And they had guns. Over the course of that year, we would experience that exact same trauma 4 times while we were having big press conferences to present oversized checks to undersized missions, because we refused to do the critical work to build the capacity to change public narrative and change public policy. So what's philanthropy's role? I think part of what philanthropy has to do is to be the patient venture capital to invest in building the infrastructure to change policy and narrative over time. Meaning we can't be content to count the number of heads in a classroom or count the number of Black boys that we can put a white shirt and a tie on and say they went through our 6-week job training program, even though we weren't going to hire them for the job on the other side. We actually have to invest in organizing. We have to invest in advocacy. We have to invest in narrative change work. We have to invest in media strategies so that we can actually do the work to reduce the stigma of Blackness, the criminalization of Blackness off of people, to change public opinion. And that will help to inform and shift narratives to change public policy. Having done some of that work with the brilliance of the young Black organizers in this community, a 2-year campaign, everybody who does public policy work knows it takes 5 to 7 years to do anything. A 2-year campaign closed the medium security jail here in the city of St. Louis earlier this year because of young Black and brown organizers who some of them were unemployed. Their leader was working as a pharmacy tech during the Ferguson uprising in 2014. But she's now leading an organization called Action St. Louis that built the power, that mapped the issues, that implemented a strategy to close a jail that makes available $16 million a year to reinvest in health and human services in the city of St. Louis, right? Those are the things that can happen if we will venture to invest in things that we haven't seen work before. And we will invest in public policy and community engaged strategies and not just another program. And if we will support leaders who don't talk like, look like, smell like, act like us, but rather see things from a different perspective. And I think philanthropy, which has been historically the social venture capital for social change in America, has the responsibility to grab hold of that moniker again. And that can be liberative for all of us.
Yeah, and I think just to summarize, if that's even necessary, what we're talking about is for those people that are still in a charity mindset. We are not talking about charity. We are talking about justice.
Yes.
And that requires a different level of boldness, intentionality, patience. It requires us to play the long game. It requires us to adjust what was success in a charitable model are not the same measurements that you use in one that is about justice.
Absolutely. You're spot on. I'm a preacher. I use too many words, Chanda. You got it right.
No, I love it, man. Look, I appreciate your time. I greatly appreciate your leadership. I have thought about you as you are taking a baton from one of our legacy leaders, Marion Edelman Wright, who has been a pioneer, a leader, a drum major for justice, like all of these things, right? You're taking it into the next level on behalf of our community and our young people in prayer, preparing them to be the leaders that will keep pushing us forward. I thank you for that. You know, I support you. You know, even if we don't talk, no, I'm back here like with my you know, cheering and supporting and ready to stand with you if you need it.
Thank you. Greatly appreciate it. It is, you know, we got a remarkable team there in Minneapolis too, led by Bharti Warhi with CDF Ohio, and I'm excited about the work. Mrs. Edelman is, the best way I can say it is she's one of the mothers of the movement. And in that sense, along with the long tradition of Diane Nash and the long tradition of Ella Josephine Baker and the long tradition of Rosa Parks, she is one who has helped to guide us into this moment and created an infrastructure, frankly, that now bridges from what Jim Lawson called the nonviolent movement of America, which many of us call the contemporary civil rights movement, bridging from the civil rights movement to the movement for Black lives. She has built and carried this institution, and with great love and honor for her and for the children that she has served, for quite frankly, all the servant leaders across this country whom she has helped to train and to nurture, from the mayor of Stockton, California, to the pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ in Chicago. She has planted a remarkable crop of leaders for this community and for this country. And I'm glad to walk in that tradition and to walk with her in it. And I look forward to great things that God is doing through that remarkable mission. And I'm glad to be a part of it.
Thank you. I hope you enjoy however you can in this moment, this day.
Yeah. I enjoy by listening to my 5-year-old. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks. We'll be in touch soon. Thank you.
That's Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson and Chanda Smith Baker. You can follow Chanda on Twitter at Chanda S. Baker. This is Sue Pak Kienitz from the Minneapolis Foundation. Thank you for listening to Conversations with Chanda.